I was going to talk about, why we wanted to believe. And someone commented on one of my videos saying, why should he believe anything that I say? Just because we got a bunch of scientists who, expert specialists, who, all they have is theories they can't prove. And he doesn't understand that, they can actually prove most or all of it, of course. He thinks that if these PhD professors had any common sense, then they'd believe the same credulous fables he does, despite the fact that it's got talking snakes and donkeys and the sun stopping in the sky and all of that sort of thing. Yet somehow he thinks that book has proven itself and that science hasn't. And this is a huge mystery for me because I encounter people who think like this all the time. I've talked to several people who've made this claim, that the Bible has proved itself and science has not. And none of them can show me how their book or their interpretation of that book had gotten anything right, ever. They simply don't question that or won't question that. Most of them won't even read the book. And even when they do, or whether they do, regardless, they just imagine that it says whatever they want it to say. And I've done other presentations talking about how people read between the lines and then they don't read the lines. And they won't question that, but they'll question whatever I can show that we actually know and prove to be true. And I'm a little confused at how they think like that too. And I've seen plenty of people, I've actually seen people literally put their fingers in their ears to defend their belief from the reality. I suspect that they know that what they believe is not really true. They just want to protect that anyway. And I was on a debate, an online debate, a written debate, and the admin deleted the entire conversation with the admission that he did so because he realized I was making sense. And he didn't want anyone else to notice because he didn't want to change his mind. That's how dishonest faith is. And so people ask me, why can't I believe what I want to believe after I've already proven that what they believe is not true? Why would you want to believe something after you know it's not true? This is a mystery to me. I don't have the need to believe that a lot of other people do, obviously. It's something I can even relate to. It's like an investigation for me to figure out why people want to believe or make believe, because that's what I'm convinced that it is. One woman told me that if I say anything against her religion that seems to make sense, it is only because it is the devil speaking through me, for he is the Lord of lies. So that any challenge to her faith wouldn't prompt her to think the way I'm hoping that she will. Instead, it'll cause her to double down with the backfire effect, because she'll know that she's engaging with the devil and that she needs to believe harder. How do you believe harder? It's like when they say, if you believe hard enough, Tinkerbell will be alive again. It means you're trying to convince yourself. That means you're pretending, right? And at some point, you'd think these people must be aware that that's what they're doing, right? It's literally a fantasy. The idea is that if you can just convince yourself, then you can live in this land of pure imagination. And then you won't be of this world. It'll be like a matrix-like illusion where you'll have special powers, where you can suddenly command cancer to go into remission or tell that mountain to jump into the ocean, and it will. You just gotta believe. Of course, it doesn't really work. No mountain has ever leapt from one place to another. And imagine the tsunami that would happen if it did. This is something Jesus ought to think about before he tells people to do these things. It's all about the power of pretend. If you believe hard enough, you can cure diabetes. Or you could have if you were pure of heart. But now that your subject has died, we see that your faith wasn't pure enough. So there's always logical fallacies and double standards and confirmation biases culminating in a culture that cultivates this reinforces this deadly delusion. And psychiatrists define delusion as a fixed false belief that will not change despite evidence to the contrary. And they have an exception in their medical journals that, this applies except in the case of religion. Really, seriously, special exception. Why? If the belief is irrational, as religious belief certainly is by definition, then why can't we say so? Why are we being inappropriately polite to a debilitating cognitive impediment? I acknowledge that everyone has the right to believe whatever they're compelled to believe for whatever reason. Similarly, they have a right to not believe it anymore when it doesn't make sense anymore. And I think that the ability to think and wonder freely is the most basic of all human rights. Yet it is religion and not reason that opposes even that by prohibiting or by enforcing required beliefs by enforcing required beliefs and prohibited beliefs and threatening free thought with the threat of a fate worse than death. And some people think of religion as a disease of the mind, but I don't. I think of it more like an addiction. It has the same chemical and emotional cues as some addictions, and it must be a hell of a drug, because people will fight for it against all reason. And I remember one guy who pretended to be very objective about his belief, but then he very quickly admitted that he would rather take a bullet in the ear than to give up his faith. So much for his objectivity that he wanted me to believe in. And that's another thing. A lot of believers don't want anything to ever be objective. A well-known Christian apologist told me that not even facts can be objective. Nothing ever can be, because believers will not allow anything to clear the fog from their minds that keeps them from believing. And sometimes they'll admit that they don't care what the truth is, they just want to believe what they want to believe. They don't need evidence to convince them as long as they can keep ignoring the evidence that proves them wrong. Don't harsh my buzz, man. And the analogy of addiction works a couple of other ways too. One is because believers think they're happier than non-believers, much like drunks think they're happier than sober people. And another is also like ex-smokers tend to be the most outspoken enemies of smoking, right? Because they know, they have personal experience for how poisonous this is. And former believers also have the shame of being duped by their former religion, and very, very often they were abused within that religion. And just like with all the sexy imagery that is traditionally associated with smoking, like especially in classic movies, you have the same sort of thing with religious belief, such that believers are good, upstanding, moral, and responsible people, while unbelievers are sinful and slovenly, baby-eating heathens, wallowing in the darkness of our God-forsaken, miserable, damnable existence. So if you're Christian, it means that you're good and clean and nice, and you got common sense. But if you dare admit that you can't really take those fables seriously, then it is only because you hate everything about our decent, law-abiding culture in a free country, so why don't you go to some suitably oppressive communist Muslim wasteland? And whereas I would say that a fool is one who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence, believers obviously don't see it that way. Somehow credulous gullibility regarding the most repugnant fables known to man is seen as a virtue, and it's supposed to make believers better than, rational thinking people. Better because faith is portrayed as a virtue, as if having an unreasonably closed and incurious prejudiced mind is a good thing. Better because faith somehow makes you more moral than those who are merely good for their own health or for the benefit of society without a fear of posthumous damnation. Better because they don't have to know what the real truth is. They don't even have to know what the word truth means. They can just recite their favorite lie and call that the absolute truth with a capital T, while denigrating anyone who honestly knows better. Belief means having an excuse that explains everything they don't understand, and they don't even have to understand that they don't understand it, or that it doesn't explain anything. They're just pretending to know what they know they don't know, and they have to do that, or else they're not believing hard enough. And all of that makes them better than any honest person who isn't content to pretend things that aren't true, and instead who only wants to understand reality as it is, regardless what the truth turns out to be. Now, how did this rift divide the rational and irrational perspective? I know that not all atheists are rational. We're not all logically contemplative philosophy of science scholars or honorable humanists. Anybody on social media knows that by now. We can't all pretend like we're sophisticated intellectuals anymore. And in fairness, I do have to admit that there are some religious believers of strong faith who can be quite convinced that they're rational, even though they're not, of course. I want to be as generous as possible, but the idea that there's such a thing as a reasonable faith is still a contradiction. This guy commenting on my video said that if anything is so complicated that scientists haven't figured it all out yet completely and know it all for certain, 100%, then it must be the work of some magic invisible genie or something equally silly. That's the only thing that makes sense to him. But if we have trouble coming up with a cure for cancer, it isn't because God was so clever that he designed cancer to fool us. And how does this guy not understand that the closer you look at anything you can imagine, the more complex it turns out to be? And this is the nature of nature itself. Everything is like that. The idea that gods and magic are the simplest and most infantile excuses men have ever dreamt up to explain anything, and it doesn't explain anything. Creationists challenge me all the time. How to show that life came from non-life without God? How do you explain life without God? And I do show them ways that can happen, but more importantly, I point out that they can't explain how anything happens with God, right? How does God do anything? Magic words, let there be. And they say God is the answer, but it's not. I mean, you can hypothesize that something happened by magic or by alien intervention or whatever you want to make up, but it doesn't become the answer until you can show that it is. And until you can show that there's some truth in it, then there evidently is no truth in it. And that is the burden of proof that believers hate so much. They want to push it off onto us because, that's fine because we can meet that burden, but they can't. And they know they can't. And I suspect that they know why they can't. Because religious belief is all about pretend. It's not what they believe so much as what they make believe. It's about asserting baseless, empty speculation as if it were certain fact and then pretending to know what you don't know anything about. How many times have you heard a believer state as fact what they believe is as though it was something they could confirm if challenged? Claiming facts that are not facts or feigning knowledge you don't have are both lies, but that's what all religions do and depend on. If a creationist tries to challenge me on my worldview, they can only tell me what they believe, but I can show what I know and the facts to back it up, which believers can't do. And that's why religious belief is dependent on irrational flaws in reasoning. Every logical fallacy has been used as an argument for God, and every argument for God is a logical fallacy. And just because something is complex doesn't mean God did it. Look how complex theology is. Even if you imagine that yours is the one true faith and that you're the one that has the real relationship with your imaginary friend and that everybody else with any other religion is just crazy and pretends that they have what you do, you still have to admit that their theology is very complex, even if you believe that they just made it up themselves. So look at Hinduism, the oldest religion in continuous practice, with myriad denominations and traditions based on a library of sacred scriptures, not just one book. And all of their books are older than any of the books in the Bible. There are 800 million Hindus, way more than Protestant Christians. As a matter of fact, if Catholics are not really Christian, as many Protestants insist, then Christianity is not the dominant religion, Islam is. And then Catholicism, then Hinduism, and then Protestants, Baptists, Pentecost, Methodists, etc. We've made up a bunch of gods and we've made up different versions of them. We have thousands of interpretations of distinct denominations of different religions that are all just the heresies of some theologian's imagination. I encountered an arrogant, conceited, and pompous professor of theology last year at a seminary school who looked down at his nose at me and described himself as a serious theologian. How the fuck could anybody be a serious theologian? Theology is the study of the nature of God and of religious belief. But there is no nature of God. God doesn't have properties. And if he did, no one would or could know how to identify them because there is not one fact that anyone can verify or falsify that anybody could actually know. Right? So nobody knows what they're talking about. One interpretation is just as good as everyone else's. They're all equally invalid. Anyone claiming a relationship with a personal God simply imagines their invisible friend is whatever they want it to be, and that's why it matters so much to them. And there's no way to distinguish anyone's religious belief from the illusions of delusion. If there is nothing anyone can objectively verify or falsify about their God, then there's nothing anyone can know about God because there is no fact to start with, and thus nothing you could actually study. So, theology is just a study of belief. It's just the fables that men made up about their gods. It's a scholarship in mythology. And that's why having a PhD in theology is virtually the same as having a doctorate in Mother Goose. If you can't confirm the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then it is a fact that you don't actually know what you claim to know. So much for the claim that you can't know anything without God. Turns out you can't know anything with God. Matter of fact, just believing in God can't prevent you from knowing things. So what about this God-shaped hole in our hearts? What some people refer to as being hardwired for God belief. This is how I describe that in my book. Did you ever get the feeling you're being watched? We humans are a very self-conscious sort, so it's not at all unusual that we think others are paying close attention to us. And awareness of that possibility is a necessity when you're living in a wilderness area where there may be large predators stealthily closing in. So it's easy to see how that feeling could have been ingrained in our psyche over the ages. Of course, our psychology is much more complicated than that because we're also a social species. Even when no one is watching, it still matters what anyone who looks at us might see. At any moment, secret admirers may be gazing at us undercover. Rivals may be there too, sizing us up to find our weaknesses. Or there may be concealed critics ready to ridicule anything they notice. Our conduct and our appearance are always subject to judgment, even when we think we're alone. Any mistake or embarrassing moment might have been seen by someone and may be reported to someone else. Whatever we did today that we think might be secret might come back to visit us tomorrow and could change the course of the rest of our lives. So we need to be aware that there may be eyes spying on us at any time. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean they don't see you. So if it is safer to assume that you're never really alone, ever, better to conduct yourself as if someone may be watching and that it matters to them who you are and what you're doing. If that sounds paranoid, it shouldn't. I think that's just the way normal people normally behave. But there are also those who take it to extreme, who are convinced that they're under constant surveillance at all times and that all of their actions, and sometimes even their thoughts, are being noted by someone somehow. Each of us tends to place ourselves in the center of our world. In fact, we're individually so self-centered that if we're not the center of attention, we complain that we should be, that we're not getting the attention we deserve. And we naturally assume that someone potentially could be examining us at any time, or maybe even all the time. It is natural for us to feel that way even when it is irrational, and we're also very good at recognizing patterns and making connections. And we're still analytical even when we're irrational. It's just that our analysis may be focused on our primary suspicions and biased against any more logical options. Consequently, some patterns emerge in our minds, appearing as though they were orchestrated, as if what had happened before will happen again, not because of diminishing probabilities, but because we think that's what's supposed to happen. One person's string of successes may begin to look like luck, and we may imagine that that person is blessed, and that they have advantages being manipulated by outside entities. And similarly, one who suffers several successive setbacks may appear to be cursed. And so we will think that one of them is being punished and the other rewarded. And of course, the reason would be is that they must have done something to deserve whatever is happening to them. It's the simplest form of karma, that what goes around comes around. For people who think this way, of course, then nothing ever happens by accident. Everything happens for a reason. And one of my favorite shows as a kid was The Twilight Zone with Rod Serling. And the pattern that I noticed of that was that everybody got their just desserts. Good-natured, pleasant, and charitable characters always seem to do all right because the author of that reality didn't want to, he didn't want to torment kindly people, and he knew his audience didn't want that either. But the people who were cruel, greedy, selfish, prejudiced, and so on, were going to face ironic consequences as a sort of poetic justice, as if the universe cared about balancing good and evil. And not only does life often seem to be that way, but it seems like it should be that way. Wouldn't it be great if it was that way? And that's why it's so nice to pretend that it is. And I'm sorry to say that I'm as guilty as anyone else for holding this sort of irrational feeling. All my life, it seemed that I had established some sort of a deal with the fates, that I would never have great wealth and fame. At the same time, I wouldn't be sitting in a prison or suffering through some chronic debilitating condition. I was in some middle ground, because karma charges a price for great advantages. And there were certain things that, I'm not going to get that advantage, but then I'm not also going to have to suffer through something that I couldn't even deal with. So it didn't bother me that I wasn't some wealthy celebrity, because I wasn't in prison either. And it didn't matter that I've always been poor and hounded by debt collectors and never had nice things, because I had a pretty good misspent youth. I am fortunate enough that in my youth I was good looking and always in great health, and I considered that to be a pretty good deal. It really did seem that I'd struck a deal with something, that I was in effect blessed. So you can see how it's easy to imagine people being that way. These days I realize that simply having a positive attitude can account for a lot of that. And otherwise I logically understand that things can't really be orchestrated this way. And everybody wants to think that everything happens for a reason. God sees every sparrow fall and so forth. And that God will help you find your keys or win the game. How? Exactly what is the mechanism that God uses? And why does he ignore all these really sincere requests? I mean, wouldn't you think, okay, I can't find my keys and this other person can't find their child? Wouldn't you just say, okay, I don't care if the Cowboys lose the game, okay? Take my wit, put it off onto her. Somebody with a more sincere prayer than mine. And consequently, the last religious belief I ever gave up was karma. I held on to that one as long as I could, because I really wanted to believe that there was some innate sense of justice in the universe, especially when I see terrible people getting everything they want despite exploiting or victimizing others and making the situation worse. The villains very often feel vindicated and victimized, and they never realize that they're guilty of anything. I mean, it always seems like they feel justified in whatever they've stolen, as if it was rightfully theirs to begin with. That's not justice. And it's not enough to imagine they're getting their punishment posthumously either. Leviticus 26 says that we will experience our punishment in this life, not the next one, which is how it should be, especially when you realize that you can't really have an afterlife anyway. Sadly, I've seen too many cold, cruel, and thoughtless people excel at the expense of others while the nice guy finishes last. And no one wants to mess with the sociopaths, so those without compassion or compunction too often prevail in oppressing others who never did anything to deserve what was wrought upon them. Fortunately, I'm not talking about my own experience, but rather what I see happening to other people, so I think that the observation is objective. Being kind and charitable, noble, honest, and so on doesn't mean that you'll be treated in accordance with your standards. It should mean that. And if there was a righteous God, if there was a sense of justice or karma, it would mean that. But if only there was some invisible Rod Serling writing the screenplays of our lives. So religion doesn't grant knowledge or wisdom or morality, which we haven't talked about. Robert Green Ingersoll, famously and accurately observed that if a man were to follow today the teachings of the Old Testament, he would be a criminal. If he would follow strictly the teachings of the New Testament, he would be insane. And the way I put that, flying saucers here? Yeah. The way I would put that is that anyone who uses the Bible as a moral guide would be considered immoral by every culture on the planet. There are also negative correlations on the relationship between religion and child abuse, prejudicial bigotry, cognitive ability, and education. The more you know, the less you believe. And the more religious you are, the more abusive you are, and so on, statistically. So why does anyone commit themselves to a belief that they know can't even be figuratively true? I know people who will brag that they're Christians, even though they're drug addicted, alcoholic, fornicating criminal convicts on their third marriage. They've never cracked open a Bible and don't care what it says and don't even know what a creed is, but they're better than us because they're Christian and that means good. For such people, your religion is like your choice of football teams. where we wouldn't even know you had a religion if you didn't wear the logo on your jersey and take part in the game on Sunday. And these obviously aren't real Christians, no matter how typical they may be. It's more like a Christian cosplay. So what about the sincere believers? Why do they believe? And one of my friends identifies as Christian. He says, I'm Christian because I like to believe that, not because I think it's true. Okay, so some people pretend to believe. What about the rest? I've heard believers say that I believe because I want to know that I'm going to see my dead son or father again. As tragic as that is, they're just pretending. You may convince yourself, you make believe to convince yourself that you're going to see your dead relatives again, but it still doesn't mean you know that. And others said, well, I have to believe because I don't want to go to hell. But that means you believe in hell already. And hell wouldn't even be a threat if you didn't believe in it. So figure that out. And faced with the obvious indication that the Bible is a conglomeration of mythologies adopted and adapted from various religions, I've seen believers admit that none of that could have happened as described. Yet they'll still say, it has truth for me. No, it doesn't. If it was true for you, it would be true for me, and it would be true for everybody else too. And if it isn't true for me, it's not true for you. And someone else told me that they believe everything in the Old Testament they believe everything that happened in the Old Testament really happened, even though that they know that that's impossible. And the reason that they believe it is because they believe that Jesus believed it. Again, they believe because they believe. It's a circular argument, routing back to an assumed conclusion. But Jesus is not a reputable or reliable or even a real witness to any of this. Remember, the story says that Jesus believed in Noah's Ark, which we know didn't happen. He also believed the world was flat. And he said that we didn't have to wash our hands because it doesn't matter what we put into our mouths, it will not defile us. Because it doesn't go into our heart, it only goes into our belly and is then eliminated. So apparently, Jesus thought it was fine to drink bleach because it'll just pour harmlessly out the other end. So we know that Jesus didn't know anything about poison or nutrition or infectious microbes or drugs, or even the earlier Jewish scriptures that say that certain foods can make you impure. If Jesus says you can put anything into your mouth without even washing it first, I have to question his position on homosexuality too. I'm sorry, was that irreverent? Jesus says that what comes out of a man's mouth will defile him because he believed in curses and magic words, and he thought diseases were caused by demons. And he cursed a tree for not bearing fruit out of season. So if Jesus was real, and you met him in real life, you would very quickly see that this is not the sort of man you would take advice from. And rather than talk to people who may have grown up religious and therefore may have never had a rational thought, I prefer to talk to those who say that they were once atheists before they became religious, because their inability to answer this question is more illustrative of how dishonest faith really is. Of the few people that I've interviewed who claim to be atheist before becoming Christian, one of them that I could verify actually was in this position at one point, she went back to her religious belief because she missed her church congregation where her husband and her entire family still is. That's not a reason to believe. That may be a reason to pretend to believe. And in her case, she had another reason, which was that she lost reputation with atheists by pretending to have an academic degree that she didn't really earn. And one of the another Christian that I interviewed lied, saying that she had converted to Christianity after examining the facts in evidence. And I pressed her on that one, don't think I didn't. But after 20 minutes of grilling and her dodging the question about what that evidence was, she finally admitted, the fact is that the guys at the Christian table at her college were hot. Again, that's not a reason to believe. That's a reason to pretend to believe. And you still could have shouted his name during that act anyway. I also interviewed a petrogeologist claiming to be a former evolutionist who said that the evidence changed his mind. But again, he would not say what that evidence was. He said it was personal and he would only discuss it privately. So how scientific could that evidence be? Turns out that he was raised never to question the Bible even when the facts contradict it, and that's why he was holding his position. So he was never an evolutionist or an atheist or any of that. He was just a liar. And I recently, maybe some of you saw this a week or so ago, I interviewed a biochemist who was never religious until he fell victim to the God of the Gaps fallacy. He didn't understand some aspect of quantum physics, and he decided that that meant that the universe was irrational. So he made a conscious decision to become irrational too. That's how he described it. He rejected rationality. If you can't explain something using methodological naturalism, you can't just throw up your hands and say, I don't know, therefore magic. Especially when you throw on a bunch of other assumptions, like that the Bible is true, even though he says that it's actually not, that we can prove that most of the Bible is not true. But he says it's okay because you can just get rid of the whole Old Testament and just believe in Jesus. How do you like that for theology? He also says that the reason he's Christian is because he believes that Jesus is God in the flesh. So again, he believes in Jesus because he believes in Jesus. And the real reason is that he's immersed in Christian theology and he doesn't know anything else, and he's admitted that he had no reason to believe other than he simply wants to. And that seems to be what it comes down to. And again, I don't understand what the motivation is. It should be that you wouldn't decide which God to believe in until you can verify that there is a God at all. And you shouldn't believe in any supernatural thing until you've got indication that there is something supernatural. And you can't just assume magic just because the real answer is unknown. But this guy went backwards and just assumed the truth of the Bible as his first step. Worse than that, he assumed that the New Testament is true even though it says the Old Testament isn't. And apparently this is the way you think when you reject rationality, as he admits he has. But the question-begging arguments from ignorance and incredulity cannot be considered evidence of God. And the fact that Jesus is described as a traveling magician and cult leader who couldn't do his faith healing shtick in his own hometown because the people who grew up with him knew him and knew that he was full of shit, and that his knowledge was limited to just less than the other scholars of his day, or even farmers of his day knew things he didn't. He's limited in knowledge to the learned or the writings of the other ignorant primitives of his time. And all of this proves that he is not God. So the reason the biochemist chose Christianity is the very reason he should have rejected it. And some people think they see patterns of divine creation or divine design. And no, we see patterns of things that aren't there every time we look in the clouds. But the indications are, all of the indications are, that man created gods in his own image. When the early humans first started fashioning things out of wet clay, they made lovely animals and wished that they could breathe into them the breath of life. And then somebody else suggested that, hey, maybe somebody else has already done that, and that meant that we might have come from clay figurines. And they really liked that story. They got attached to that story until somebody said, well, I don't believe that. So they killed him. Along with every other unbeliever. Until all that was left, think about natural selection here, until all that was left was righteous defenders of the faith. And look at the culture that has emerged from that. For thousands of years, we've been making myths of magical men and monsters. All our folklore is full of fantasy. Our music and movies are riddled with religious references. It's no coincidence that Thor existed in the old sagas and in modern Marvel Comics movies. He was a magical hero then as now. And I have to ignore some of the lyrics in my favorite songs because they're all about heaven and hell. You know, that's typical for heavy metal because, it's the devil's music. So a lot of people believe because they find the fantasy and imagery more interesting than reality, and I understand why a lot of them would. But it leads to the Oprah distortion, where atheists can't experience awe or wonder. Have you heard her say that? Yeah, we can, of course, better than believers can. And the reason that we can is because we have a concept and a comprehension of the reality, and we can appreciate the data. Rather than exaggerating everything we don't understand and say, isn't God great, every time we can't properly appreciate something for what it really is. But the reason most people want to believe is because they either want to pretend that they'll never die or that they'll exist in some conscious way after they die. But either way, they want to imagine that there's a meaning and a purpose to life. And I never understood this one. I never needed existence itself to have a meaning. The idea is conceptually silly to me. But for some people, understanding science or even humanist philosophy can prompt an uncomfortable realization, like when Buzz Lightyear saw himself advertised on TV and realized that he is just a toy. You all remember that scene? He even tried to evoke faith. No, it can't be true. I could fly if I wanted to, like a bird in the sky. If I believe I can fly, why, I'd fly. Thud. Realizing that you're not really a space ranger, that you're just a toy, must be, I imagine, like realizing that you're not the reason the universe exists, and that maybe you're not best buds with the most powerful being imaginable, an indomitable genie who can solve any problem, even if it means making 2 + 2 = 5. It's got to be hard letting go of an imaginary friend who can do anything, even when he obviously can't do anything at all. And that's why religious believers object to reality so harshly, often referring to other people as if they were just bags of chemicals. The universe wasn't created just for you, so you got to be pissy about it, as if people have no value just because your fantasy didn't come true. The fact that you exist doesn't mean that your God exists. It doesn't mean anything. You have no special purpose, unless you mean that in the sense that Steve Martin did in The Jerk. It takes a virtue of humility to accept that you're not important enough on a cosmic scale to be part of any universal plan. We can't have a universal plan, certainly not under this administration. But there is a beautiful message in Toy Story, as Buzz Lightyear eventually realized, when he accepted what he really is and learned how he matters to those who care about him and who need him. Even if there is a God, the meaning of your life is determined by what your life meant to other people, in addition to the purpose you've chosen for yourself. I thank you very much.